Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Russ Baker. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Well, you're a new breed of investigative journalists, and you've invested a lot of time in these projects. You're an investigative journalist at a time when we need it more than ever. Tell us about your website.
Sure. It's called WhoWhatWhy.com. We are a nonprofit. We're nonpartisan, but we are not afraid to shake things up. We dig deep. We don't have any preconceptions of what we're going to find, but whatever we find, we tell it, and we tell it straight, and we back it up with documentation.
Well, among your fans are the legendary Bill Moyers, who goes to your site all the time, and he appreciates the kind of journalism that you do. And also, you are an author. You have spent years on this book called Family of Secrets: The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Well, you spent how many of your last years compiling this book?
I spent 5 years on that.
Uh-huh. And I have to tell you, you have footnotes. I think you fact-checked it within an inch of its life. And you have pages of footnotes, and I know it's very arcane, hidden materials that you had to work with. And for people who want to know, how did you write this book?
Well, basically, back in 2004, having already written about the non-existent weapons of mass destruction, I was one of the first reporters to question Judith Miller's reporting in the New York Times, and feeling that there was something going on that was not really being reported on as to these complications, if you will, that America was plunging itself into. And so I determined to try to figure out if there was more to the story of the Bush presidency than we understood, communally speaking. And so I began, without any particular information, traveling the country, interviewing people, obtaining documents, trying to understand what it meant that George W. Bush had become the most powerful person in the world, and that he was doing these things. Who, if anybody, was behind his rise, the power of his family. I didn't know what I would find, if anything, but through those 5 years, after probably the first 2 years, I began kind of going down what you'd call rabbit holes and finding some of the most extraordinary things that changed my perceptions, not only of George W. Bush, but also of his father, and not only of their family, but of the influence of power sectors in this country and in shaping its history that I myself had not understood.
Well, I think it's very important. I'd like to read the quote that you start the book with, because people think it's all new and suddenly people are waking up that there could be other forces that were behind the scenes. But in 1933, FDR said, "The real truth of the matter is that a financial element in the larger centers has controlled government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson."
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's very important, because what I found in my research for Family of Secrets, which, by the way, although it's ostensibly about the Bush family, it has extensive material on many different presidencies, going back through most of the 20th century. And what I found was all new to me, and really forced me to rethink and to realize that many of the narratives that were given in our textbooks by the establishment historians and so on are largely wrong, or in some cases just flat out wrong. But basically, this aspect about financial interests is something that we all understand on some level. We see this all the time, particularly with the state of the economy now, and as we're learning more and more about the inside advantages that the very wealthy have in this country. And yet, somehow, we don't really discuss that. It's not really part of the day-to-day news coverage. It's not really part of academia in terms of fully analyzing the impact that these power centers have on our country, on our world, and on our own daily lives.
But this has become, it's coming to the fore with the passage of the Citizens United. Talk to me a little about how that is changing our politics.
Well, money already ruled the roost, and it's just getting worse. And of course, once money controls the system, it's easy for money to keep on gaining additional advantages. And so this decision, the influence that big money has over who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, what those people do, what Congress does, whether Congress is going to intervene with legislation to try to ameliorate some of these damages to the public interest. And the reality is that big money gets more and more influence. The system has been massively corrupted. We need really, really drastic action if we're going to get back to any kind of semblance of democracy in this country.
Well, I want to look a little, I have a long interest in media matters, and I'd like to help us, walk us through a little bit about what happened, because we always used to operate from the same set of facts as a culture, as a nation. Walter Cronkite was on CBS Evening News for 19 years, and when he ended his show with, "And that's the way it is," pretty much people thought, and felt that they had found out that that's the way it was. But then in those years since then, news came from being like an obligation, the burr under the saddle of the networks. It wasn't for profit. Then suddenly it had to be for profit, and suddenly we had celebrity news and bread and circuses, and we find that it's the big corporations again that actually own the news outlets. Can you walk us through that path?
I used to be a big defender of my field of journalism, and I used to feel that basically we all tried to do our best, and that as a system it largely worked. I no longer believe that. The more I do historical research, the more I conclude that it was never the way it is. That's the way it is was never the way it was. And now it's a bigger problem because of the world hurtling towards possible self-extinction. War is all over the place, a greater gap between rich and poor. So it's more of a crisis than ever, the quality and the nature of the information we get. But I'm afraid that powerful interests have always controlled what we were told. The newspapers were always owned by very, very wealthy people who were deeply connected to other wealthy people in banking and oil and military procurement and what have you. And there were always other agendas in play, even though the reporters, I think, by and large, have always tried to do the best job they could do while also keeping their jobs.
Earlier you mentioned false narratives. So who writes them, who sells them, and why do we buy them?
Well, when you're a small minority with a disproportionate amount of power, and this is not just true of the United States, this applies anywhere. But in other countries, when you've got an authoritarian or totalitarian government, you can be a small clique and just do what you want because you've got the force of arms behind you. In a country like the United States or Australia or England or anything where we at least purport to be a democracy where the people make the decisions, it's very, very important to have the people on your side. And this means that you must control what they understand, and you must control how they think about things. Well, the first order of business, of course, is to engage with those vehicles of information and propaganda. And so whether you're an oil company or a bank or you're people from those industries who go in and out of government all the time, you understand this. And the U.S. military and the CIA and all of these enterprises are very, very deeply engaged on a day-to-day basis, both on the surface with their armies of PR people, but also covertly with trying to shape public perceptions by feeding false stories to the media, by working with people inside the media who are themselves either witting or unwitting agents of influence. This is not something that I'm making up here. Even Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein, after he left that team, wrote a piece for Rolling Stone about the extent to which the CIA had penetrated major news organizations. So this is just a natural course that you would take. And in fact, if you talk to people in the military, they won't deny that they have extensive, what they call information operations. In other countries, they drop leaflets with information that may or may not be true for a desired outcome. Of course, in this country, they've got to bury it much deeper because of the uproar. We see little bits of that, the curtain parts briefly. For example, when we found out that many of those analysts on the television news programs who were telling us how to think about what was happening in, say, Iraq, for example, or Afghanistan, were in fact people who were on the payroll of the very interests who were trying to shape the whole thing.
On your website, you have a story about the Osama bin Laden piece that was in the New Yorker. I think that's a very good example of this. Tell us about that piece briefly.
Sure. Well, you know, I, like most folks, love to read the New Yorker. It's a great magazine, and I don't think this is an indictment of it overall, but in this case, I think this is a very telling example. They ran a celebrated article that this was finally the inside story of that raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, which we are told resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden. Now, many people were skeptical of that story for lots of reasons, including the fact that we'd been given the impression over the years that he couldn't possibly be alive anymore. Yeah. And we'd also been told false stories about so many military adventures, both from the WMDs back through the first Gulf War with the phony stories of the babies being thrown out of the incubators, you know, the stories of Jessica Lynch, and on and on and on. Pat Tillman. I mean, the false stories go back to the Maine with the Spanish-American War. So I mean, this has been a stock in trade. But you know, in this case, we had some doubts about that, particularly also because the administration told us conflicting stories that were wildly conflicting the first few days and never really resolved that. And so we've been wondering, and here comes this definitive account, or what we're told is a definitive account of what took place. And the Washington Post did an initial story where they reported that there were some problems with the story, because when you read it, it describes what the Navy SEALs are doing moment by moment, and even what they're thinking and feeling. And it was this reporter from the Washington Post who revealed that, in fact, the New Yorker reporter never spoke to any of the SEALs, was forbidden from any kind of contact with them. And so all of this, I realized, had been fed to them by people in the administration who were trying to shape our perceptions of it. And in our article on WhoWhatWhy.com, I go through paragraph by paragraph pointing out inconsistencies and things that frankly make no sense at all. And then we reveal that the reporter who wrote that article is the son of a general, Marine general, who himself has been involved in things related to special operations throughout his career. Very disturbing things not to be revealed to the reader.
Well, we know as a fact of history that the victor writes the history, and these are attempts to write the history and to write the narrative. I look at, for example, the Bush autobiography and Dick Cheney's new book that's coming out, and they are attempting to superimpose their version of history so that it's the last one standing. And how will you do, you know, will you do a critique of Cheney's book? Will you let other people do it?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. Every time these books come out, when George W. Bush's so-called memoirs came out, the first thing that happened was people said to me, your book, Family of Secrets, is the most definitive history of what we don't know about what was really going on under George W. Bush, how he and his father came to power, the whole backstory of the shaping of the rise of people actually to the presidency, and the influence of other elements on what they do in office, and then all of these lies that are fed to us. You're the perfect person to go on these shows and analyze and talk about these books, but they won't put me on the programs. And even though I've got all these credentials, and even though Family of Secrets is a bestseller with endorsements from Bill Moyers and Dan Rather and Gore Vidal and so forth, even despite all that, even despite 50, 60, 70 pages of footnotes and declassified documents, what's in there is so disturbing and so explosive, and it runs so counter to the narrative that these corporate-backed news organizations have been giving us all the time. They simply can't reconcile it, and so they have to act like this just doesn't exist. So I've got a lot to say about all these books, Rumsfeld's book as well, but they don't want to let me come on and talk about it. And that's why I appreciate programs like yours that allow these other voices to come out.
And that's why you have a website, too.
That's why we have a website.
Because in the age of the Internet now, for a while at least, there's a lot of more access, open access to a lot of information. One of the things that you wrote that is on your website, well, no, let me go back to your book, because when you produced this piece, your friends jokingly said it should be titled "Everything You Thought You Knew Was Wrong."
Correct.
And you do come out saying that, in effect, what you've learned from all of this is that the deck is stacked. That's pretty powerful. People do not want to even approach that. And we have the American dream, we have our mythologies, we have all of that stuff that helps people get through their daily life. But to think that no matter what they do, the deck is stacked, that's a very difficult message to deliver.
That's right. And I think what's important about Family of Secrets is it's not a polemic. It's not an opinion. It's not an extended opinion piece. It's a work of investigative reporting based on facts that I uncovered that surprised me. I had to change my mind on major traumas in American history, but the upshot of it all is what you brought up at the beginning, the quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt that people in these financial centers have the deck stacked, they call the shots, they are much, much more powerful than any president could ever be.
So there are a couple of factors in this. One is the factor that the media presents a certain story that is enforced really from radio to television to print to everything. The other question, it just pains me to think of, but are we really dumbed down? What has happened? We don't teach civics anymore. People are fed bread and circuses and celebrity news. The evening news doesn't tell you why, anything in depth. And to get real news, it's only a couple of minutes of a half an hour broadcast. And how do we compare to the rest of the world in terms of, we see with our testing, math and science, we're way down there.
Well, the first thing is that our media, and this relates both to the for-profit media and even much of the nonprofit media, it's almost entirely funded by big money. And even the programs we like, even public television, we see the ads and where they come from. We have no choice because we need to do our work, and we hope that we can do it without any kind of interference. But the fact of the matter is that's always hanging over journalism in the United States. And it's certainly, if you look at the major networks, a lot of them are parts of things like GE, which are giant defense contractors, which have other interests at stake, and people learn pretty quickly what they can and cannot do. Now, when you look at the other countries, by and large, broadcasting is funded by tax dollars. And so if you look at those in France and Scandinavia and what have
BBC.
BBC, and so there is less interference. It's not to say there aren't attempts to spin them, but there's less interference. And so my travels have convinced me that Americans, in many respects, know less about their own country and about the world than people almost anywhere else, particularly in equivalent countries with similar standards of living and purported educational levels. In fact, even when you poll people in this country who have college educations, many of them, to some extent, that whole sort of industry of higher education is the universities are funded by the same wealthy interests again, and what they really teach people is not how to think for themselves or to question the conventional narratives, but how to be a good corporate citizen, how to be a good employee, how to fit in at that corporate law firm or at that big company, and to do a kind of a job that's going to keep that machinery cranking along.
One thing that I learned from you was that the famous Eisenhower quote that we should beware of the military-industrial complex, you said that it was supposed to be military-industrial academic complex.
Well, that's correct. And of course, he'd been the president of Columbia University. He understood the extent to which all of those people, good people, professors, the deans, the college presidents, are always, who's on their board, who's putting in the big money, the huge donations for adding wings to the university. It's all extremely wealthy people, and some of them, of course, have nothing but positive motivations, but many of them are deeply concerned about how they are characterized and what goes on in those classrooms. And the professors really understand that. There are very, very few of the Noam Chomskys and Howard Zinns who've been able to get into the academy and provide a contrary history, even a history that's extremely well documented and supported. To many, many people, it sounds crazy to them because they're not hearing this kind of thing.
Well, the tragic flaw in the growing suspicion of science is that, first of all, we can't even agree on common facts about like climate change, or suddenly it gets into creationism, birthers, and all that. And yet, if your loved one is dying, you want to suddenly really believe in science, and you want to have the best science there to save your loved one's life. And yet, with companies, say, underwriting medical research, and perhaps getting a skewed result that supports a drug that the company might be pushing. I don't want to get into all of this, but sometimes your life depends on knowing the facts.
Right.
And how can we get those facts?
Yeah. Well, this is why I started WhoWhatWhy.com. This is why I wrote Family of Secrets, because I want to use the remainder of my journalism career to not have to pull my punches, but to just get to the bottom line. We desperately need this. As you pointed out, when you're not feeling well, you go to the doctor. You don't avoid going to the doctor, and you don't want to hear platitudes. You say to the doctor, "Doc, level with me. I need to make some decisions, and I need to know what's really going on here." Well, we need to do the same thing with the body politic. You know, we care what goes into our bodies. We need to care what goes into our minds, and things are more desperate than ever. There are more people in this country who don't understand the basics on all of these issues. The consequences are very, very serious, and the time is now to really start moving on this.
Okay, everyone asks you, where do you get your news? What are sources that you trust?
You know, there aren't that many. I would say that there are certain journalists that I like. I mean, I'll just mention a few that I tend to find very good. McClatchy Newspapers, which is a corporate funded thing. For some reason, they've always done pretty good work, and their Washington bureau is excellent. They were very early on the WMD story, on many other stories. I like their work. I think Bloomberg, even though it's a giant billion-dollar company, for some reason you get much better reporting. They really protect their reporters from the constant pressure from the corporate world. Bloomberg, I think, is able to do it because most of their money comes from machines that they lease rather than from, say, advertising, so they're a little bit immune. Those are two, you might say, mainstream organizations I like. I also read a lot of what you call the alternative press. I think you've got to evaluate individual writers and see if in the long run their work is borne out. With WhoWhatWhy.com, we're trying to create our own brand. We want people to have a site that they can go to on a daily basis and say, you know, we trust these people. We don't think they've got an axe to grind. And they're showing us that they dug into these things, that at first on Libya, they thought that this was honorable of NATO to go in and bomb, and only later did they realize that we were being handed a line and that it was never for humanitarian motives. And of course, that makes perfect sense when you track that with other interventions elsewhere. But that we want to be a leader, and we want to train a whole new generation of journalists to do this kind of tough questioning. Now, of course, it's tough because we're a nonprofit, and we can't do this unless enough members of the public, probably just like with your station, go and donate and support our work. Otherwise, we have to be beholden to somebody else.
Well, the American citizen, once they wake up and kind of break through the denial and realize what's going on, they feel so disenfranchised. How can the American public get their government back, really have it be by, for the people and of the people?
I may sound self-serving as a journalist and somebody with a website, but I truly believe that it all comes back to good information. Without good information, you know, if you're driving and you got bad information, you go the wrong place. I mean, it all starts with being on the right road. And even most of us who think we're very well informed, who are reading those magazines and watching those TV shows and thinking that we're getting the right stuff, we're targeted. You know, we're targeted as people who are considered to be sort of the educated, the intelligentsia, are targeted more than anybody else for disinformation because it's absolutely crucial. So I think that the secret is for us to back those news and information gathering organizations that have the highest standards of integrity and independence. We need that information. If enough of us get that information and we share that with other people we know, our friends, our relatives, our coworkers who don't know the truth, this good information begins spreading. It begins inoculating and cleaning out the bad information. And then we all know how to take action. There are lots of good elected officials. There are lots of good organizations out there trying to do the right thing. They would have much more support, the right initiatives and so forth, if enough of us understood what was at stake and the kind of choices we need to be making.
But what is so stunning in a way is that we are always forced to accept from such a narrow range of choices.
Well, that's right, and this, this is one of the themes that we go into on Who, What, Why, and we are rigorously nonpartisan. The very same people, in many ways, shaped George Bush's presidency, are shaping Barack Obama's presidency. And when you stop to think of all of the blather about Bush being a conservative Republican and Barack Obama a breath of fresh air and a liberal Democrat who is going to bring in a whole different, a reversal, if you will, across the board. We've seen it in certain things, but we haven't seen it all in the big, big issues that shape our world. We don't see it on climate change. We don't see it on military policy. We're in more wars than ever. We don't see it on the stranglehold that big wealth has on the government. That's worse than ever. So you're absolutely right. The range of choices are surprisingly narrow when you consider the real range of choices, which are enormously vast. And if you look at the Europeans, for example, their normal political discourses and the people who are included are so much broader than it seems to be permitted in this country. Even the media is at fault here because when they have the debates, they marginalize very intelligent people who have interesting things to say, whether it's Ron Paul or it's Dennis Kucinich, all the way across. They make these people out to be clowns, and nobody takes them seriously. Well, people are taking Paul seriously, but they would take him more seriously. Certainly Kucinich would have had a much larger base if he'd had an opportunity to make his case.
But they even marginalized Ron Paul, who got 28% in the Iowa straw poll,
Right.
to Bachmann's 29%. She was everywhere, and nobody even mentioned Ron Paul. Even Jon Stewart on The Daily Show did a humorous bit about how he could be just 1 point behind, and nobody mentioned him. But alas, we are behind in time. We've run out of our time. Just one passionate call to action. What can we do?
I would just say people need to pay attention. They need to care. There is a deliberate effort to distract us, to fill up all of our free time with meaningless entertainment, with fabricated scandals and gossip. We need to be tougher on ourselves and say, you know what, I've got a half an hour a day or an hour a day. I'm going to put that stuff aside, the cotton candy, and I'm going to focus on some stuff that really matters to me and to my family.
Well, I'd like to thank you. Our guest today is Russ Baker. This is not Cat and Candy, your book, Family of Secrets, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.